Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Right to Read initiative. My name is Dr. Kathryn Garforth from Garforth Education, and today I have the pleasure of having Mathew Green join me for a second time to discuss his thoughts about reading. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mathew. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's wonderful to see you again. This is becoming a bit of a regular thing, which is lovely.
Yes, of course. I'm enjoying it too. So why don't you start with just a quick note of who you are and what you're currently doing?
Sure. So my name is Mathew Green. I'm a assistant principal at a school in southwestern Sydney in Australia, in beautiful Australia. And I've been doing the role for about 7 years, which is really exciting. And I also am the host of a podcast, which is a really fun little side project called The Art of Teaching. And that's kind of me. I've got two beautiful kids who are currently sleeping, and a lovely wife who I think is sleeping. And it's quite early here over in Sydney, but it's wonderful to speak to you. And so uh, I think I have the best job in the world. Like, I have the privilege of working with amazing adults and unbelievable students, and the fact that I get paid to do this is a dream come true. So yeah, it's a wonderful privilege to get to speak to you today and to share some professional learning across the seas. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. So we're going to be talking about your thoughts about reading, but I think we should, rewind a little bit and talk about learning how to read for you. Was it something that came naturally, or was it a bit of a struggle?
It's interesting you asked that, because I was having a conversation with a colleague about this yesterday, and I actually don't remember how I learned to read. I kind of I don't know. Like, it seems like this thing that just happened. But of course, then being in the position where I get the privilege of teaching people to read, I know it's a very conscious and deliberate process of teaching someone how to decode and understand text and so on and so forth. So all I remember is loving books. And for me, the library was just a real safe space. And I used to go after school and find a book, and it was my favorite thing to do. I would like to say I had a lot of friends in school. Others may disagree, but I think I had a really lovely group of close friends, but I also found incredible refuge, I think, in books. And so for me, some of my friends were like Matilda from Roald Dahl and Beatrix Potter characters and all of that kind of stuff. And so I felt I felt as though books and reading could transform me into worlds that I could barely comprehend and understand. And it was just an incredible, I think, opportunity to get to transport yourself to another world. So I think that's where I kind of fell in love with reading. In terms of how I learned to read, I just remember having a really great teacher, and we've talked about it before, Mrs. Taylor-Jones, who I remember her classroom being full of books. And so I would just go and grab a book and sit in a comfy corner and read. And I don't remember actually doing anything else in her class. I'm sure I did. So I think the passion for reading for me kind of, it happened from quite a young age, but I don't actually remember how I learned how to read. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, it's amazing when children have the ability to just almost figure it out without the appearance of trying.
Yeah.
But do you think going into your teacher training that brought any biases along for how children learn how to read?
Yeah, definitely. I assumed, and like I said, I understand just the amount of work that goes into and just how intentional the process is of teaching someone how to read and how strategic it is. But for me, I sort of assumed it happened naturally, because my understanding was I just picked up a book and I was able to read. And that's, of course, not the case. There was a lot of work behind the scenes. So I kind of just assumed that it was a process that happened. So you just surround kids with books, you put a few words on the wall, and then they magically come to school the next day and they can comprehend and read text. And of course, that's a ridiculous assumption to have. And so early on in my career, I sort of just thought it was about sort of reading to kids, which is obviously really important, but I really didn't have an understanding of the process about how to actually structure a reading lesson, how to take a child from a place of not being able to understand and read text to one who is an avid reader. And so I think for me, I assumed it was a lot more naturally occurring than what it was. And as I said, that really wasn't the case. It wasn't until I left uni, actually, where I worked with an amazing educator who really helped me to understand that process a little bit more. I don't feel in any way that my postgraduate training in education helped me to teach kids how to read. I kind of just learnt when I had an amazing opportunity to work with a brilliant colleague. So it definitely, my experience of how I learnt to read, which was, like I said, my understanding was that it was very naturally occurring and it just sort of happened, definitely, I think, hindered my ability to be able to teach others to read, because I assumed there was that same experience. And of course, that's just not the case.
Yeah. And I think that's, part of the problem. I know this is my bias, just from my experience learning how to read, that, the majority of the people that become teachers and, are in post-secondary introduces teaching teachers are the ones that can't remember learning how to read. And I'm sure they had effort. There's only a small percent of the population that seems to almost do it without trying at all.
That's interesting. Yeah.
But when you don't remember learning to read, it's hard to be able to empathize and put yourself in the position of the beginning reader.
Yeah. And I think as well, like I was so fortunate, like I had two, and I have two parents who were just avid readers. And so I remember coming home from school and the evenings were spent sort of sitting in front of the fire in beautiful England, and I would sit in front of the fire and read picture books. I remember that, or look at them. So I was really fortunate to even just have books in my house. And I know that through teaching a number of students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, that's not always the case. And so I feel incredibly fortunate that I had the, I kind of had the advantages that I did. I mean, I speak English, and embarrassingly only English. I wish I spoke other languages. So that I feel like I did have quite a, there were a number of things happening behind the scenes, I think, which helped me kind of read a little naturally. And I remember my mum and dad would work quite a bit. And so for me, going to the library after school was kind of like free childcare. And so I would turn up and read a book and chat to the librarian. And so I know that I was always surrounded by books, and then I had a wonderful teacher. So the process for me, wonderful teachers, sorry. So the process for me, I think, seemed quite natural. But like I said, looking back and having the privilege of helping children to find that love and that passion for reading, I know how much work it can be to get them to that process. Yeah, I do feel very fortunate to have had those sort of environmental factors, I think, are extremely important. And growing up in the UK, I just remember being, I think there's a wonderful history of literature. And I remember like reading like poetry and going to libraries in London and all of these wonderful things. And so I feel incredibly privileged, but I also know through reading your work and a number of other experts that it's a process which is very deliberate and can be a lot of hard work. So I don't take that experience for granted at all.
Of course. Do you remember the time when it was like, oh, maybe it's not as easy as I thought it was? Like, was there like one student or one class? It's just like, it's not what I thought it was.
Absolutely. Excuse me. Absolutely. I remember standing in front of my first kindergarten class and just thinking, like, I remember something so silly, like I asked them to pick up a book, and so many of them picked up a book, but they picked it up a different way. And so a number of our students were Arabic students. And so, of course, things like text direction and book orientation is different to English texts. And I just remember looking at them thinking, wow, we're going to have to work hard just to get text direction. And then we're going to have to work hard to talk about what's the front of the book, what's the back of the book. So many of my kids didn't have the vocabulary to explain what they saw. And look, these kids were 4 and 5, so we'll give them a bit of a break, I think. So yeah, I remember, and then I remember sitting with my first reading group and thinking in my head, I don't know if I can explain this again. I just felt so lost. And so then I thought, okay, hang on a second. There's got to be a process here. And as we've talked about in our previous episode, I don't feel like I was set up with that process coming from university. It was pretty much reading's going to happen, read them, they'll be right. And yeah, and in some ways I feel really sorry for the students I had in the first couple of years of teaching. But then I realized I was just doing my best. I was just trying.
And that's all you can do, right?
Yeah. I do feel as if I just wasn't set up for that. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about after working with this phenomenal educator in my previous school is actually equipping new graduates and teachers to be able to methodically work through the process of reading, because it was something which I didn't have. And of course, I mean, I don't need to tell you this, I'm sure it's the foundation of everything that we do and everything that we need. And so obviously a deficit or a lack of understanding and reading impacts everything. And so for me, it wasn't about, it was sort of taking a step back as well and realizing that this is the fabric the foundation that underpins everything that we do. If a child can't comprehend or read a text in reading groups, that's an issue. But of course, that stems into all other key learning areas. And so for me, I felt it was really challenging just to get those foundational components of reading right. And I think that's why I'm so passionate about the work that you do, is because it's just a skill, I think, that is so incredibly important. But I remember the look on these poor kindergarten children's faces where I was like, in my head, I'm like, you should be able to do this. And of course they couldn't, because it's just squiggles on a page. And I remember I had I retrained years later as an EALD teaching specialist. So I worked really closely with students from different language backgrounds. And I remember a presenter came in and she started speaking to the group in Arabic, I think. And she said, this is what it's like for some of your students, and handed us an Arabic text and just said, read this. And of course I looked at it. I had the book around the wrong way. I had no idea what she was talking about. And it was just a moment where I thought, wow, like, this is what so many of us students feel like, especially when it comes to reading. They're looking at text, they have no idea about the squiggles on the page. They don't have the vocabulary knowledge, they don't have the phonemic awareness. And I think you've got to take that time to be really intentional and to teach that in a way that is approachable to all students. And I remember coming out of her session, and she spoke to us in Arabic for 5 minutes. And I remember feeling so tired and overwhelmed and stressed and so completely unable to comprehend what she was talking about. It was a lesson that really stayed with me, because I thought, wow, and this is not just for non-English speaking students. I think it would be exhausting being in a classroom where it's just assumed that you know how to comprehend and how to understand a text when you just don't. And so that's just, I think, just a little example of it was a lesson that I learned, I think, that day, that we need to approach this methodically. And also, it's not just about reading for the sake of reading, it's developing that love and that passion and that excitement for text. And that's something which we may be able to get into a little bit later, but that's something which I'm really trying to do with my students at the moment, is to change that perception so that they see themselves as readers and they see themselves as people that can engage in text. But that's a whole nother conversation. I don't want to steal the flow of your questions.
Well, they kind of come to me as we're speaking. So
I know that feeling, yeah.
Now, So that this kindergarten class gave you this awareness, like, oh,
Yeah.
maybe I didn't know as much as I thought I knew. So where did you turn to?
Yeah, that's a great question. I talked about an incredible mentor that I had. There was actually two. One of them who I'm trying to get on the podcast coming up because she just changed the game for me. This wonderful lady called Samantha, and she allowed me to struggle in the nicest possible way because I thought like I just finished university and so I wanted to make a good impression, and so I think for the first couple of weeks I was just maintaining this illusion that I knew what I was doing, and of course that's ridiculous and everyone sees through that. And so I went to her and I said, Sam, I'm really struggling with this. This is not as easy as I thought it would be. And we had a really great relationship where I could just go and ask her questions. And she sort of looked up and she smiled and she said, I was waiting for you to come and talk to me about this. And I was like, well, you could have told me because it's been 3 weeks of hell, but thanks so much. And so we had a conversation and she was incredibly graceful. And this was something, like I said, I've been teaching 15 years now. And so the strategies have sort of remained the same and the research has remained quite similar, but my approach has changed so much. So early on, she just said, just choose one thing. And I thought, I can't choose one thing. I feel like my mind is all over the place. I want to do it all. And she said, no, choose one thing. Do one thing that is going to make a difference. And we decided the easiest sort of low-hanging fruit was to get quality text in the classroom. That's not hard. We had a library. So I went and for the first time, I actually was intentional about the text that I chose for my kids. And that, looking back, sounds ridiculous. Of course you would be. And so I allocated time in my timetable to read to the kids, choosing books that they loved. It was books about farting and all that kind of stuff, because that's what, wherever you are in the world, kids seem to love that. And so we read some books around that. And so for me, it actually started with just doing a modeled read in front of the kids. And it was terrifying sitting in front of a class reading. No one taught me how to do this. So I actually demonstrated that love of reading to them. And then next week I chose something else. So I did that. I maintained that practice. And I didn't drop the ball. I continued with that for the rest of the term. But next week I decided to have vocabulary around the room. Of course, it's not a revelation. Like, I think that's really important. So every time we came across a word in maths that we didn't understand, it would go on the vocabulary wall. I used to have these little thumbtacks. And so the kids, I'd write it down, give it to the kids, they'd stick it on the wall. And so that meant that vocabulary was at their level and accessible, and it was meaningful to them. And then the week after that, I decided to introduce some differentiated reading. So I would have groups that were really great at really quite competent readers, and then students that were really initial readers. And so I started to think about how I grouped my students during guided reading. So I just chose one thing each week, continued that practice. And then by the end of the term, I had sort of 7 or 8 new strategies that I was using. And it was a long process. And for someone who is incredibly impatient like myself, I wanted it up and running. I wanted them reading by term 1. And of course, that's not going to happen. But I started taking a bit of that longer perspective, I think, and thought, okay, it's not going to be perfect, but what are some of the things that we can do today to make that difference? So, I think starting with just quality texts. All schools in Australia have libraries. I'm sure it's the same in Canada and sort of Northern America. There's access to books, and there's no point them staying on a shelf in a dusty library. They may as well be in classrooms. Just chose a few things. I ensured that it was really a conversation with my supervisor, and also we just decided, she just kept me accountable to implementing a couple of these quality teaching practices. And by the end of the year, I had a number of strategies that I was using, and I started to feel really a lot more comfortable about it. That's kind of the long and the short of it, I think.
So now that your conceptualization of learning how to read was
Mhm.
beginning to change, and you've been in the leadership role. So how did moving towards that leadership role interact with your new knowledge about reading?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think when you're, my experience was that when I was in the classroom, and I still am in the classroom full time, but when I had my own class, I could control the environment. Like it was my little world. It was how I did things. It was, like I said, there was an element of control. And I think as you step back and as you begin to build that capacity in others, you have to work really hard on getting that sort of shared understanding of what reading is. I remember the first time I stepped into the leadership role, I didn't want to go in sort of gung ho and make all of these changes. I wanted to get an understanding of what was actually happening in classrooms. So my first focus was getting consistent reading programs across the school. And of course, there's so many elements to that. But one of the things I decided to do was to actually talk to the staff, and we got a big piece of butcher's paper. And I said, like, what does good reading look like? And I didn't tell them, I didn't say, this is what I expect. I said, what does it look like? And we had some wonderful suggestions like quality texts, accessible vocabulary on the walls. We had reading corners. We talked about leveled text. We had a conversation about the importance of celebrating reading. So we had a reading success wall where the students would, their award systems would be tied to the books that they chose to read at home. So for example, if they read 10 books, they got a stamp or something like that. And so we started to talk about this shared language around reading. And what was really wonderful is, as you should do in leadership, is I learned so much from them as well. I thought, that's a great idea. I'm going to take photos of my children. We have this thing on our wall where there's a photo of a kid, and then I've photocopied on A3 paper a book and stapled it so it looks like they're reading, little things like that. And so they're all over the classroom. And so every time we discover a new text, I photocopy the page of the book and I put it up there as well, so it looks like they're engaging in a new text. It's just these little sort of quirky things. And so that was an idea I stole off someone. And so we were having conversations about what does quality reading look like? If I was to go into your room, what would I see and what would I hear? And so we decided that we would see kids reading books and laughing. We would see kids smiling. We would see kids in the book corner in some cases with headphones on so that we're blocking out the sounds so that they could just get absorbed into their books. We would see audio books and listening posts. We would see groupings based on specific outcomes that we were focusing on with the kids. It could be text direction, it could be comprehending. And so we'll start to group the kids in different ability groups that are dependent on the focus that we have. And of course, these groups change every day, they change every week. And so we started to develop this sort of shared language of what reading looks like. And more broadly, in another school I worked at, one of the school leaders implemented this incredible reading policy, which meant that it's a shared policy where we all got to contribute and we all got to have this shared ownership of what it looks like in our classrooms. And so I think there's another number of things as a leader that I did, but also I think it's so important as a leader, positioning yourself as someone who is a learner. And I know the majority of my ideas have come from sitting in someone else's classroom and saying, oh, I should probably do that. And we've all got phones in our pocket all the time. And so I'll always take photos out. I'll write things down. I'll steal ideas. And it's quite common for when my team members come into my class and they'll go, isn't that my idea? And I was like, yeah, that's right. I've stolen it. This is great. And I would like to see people stealing my ideas, but I don't know if that happens. So yeah, I think there's so many other things. And as a school leader, it is a completely different ball game because, as I mentioned, you go from where you control your environment as a teacher, then to actually empowering other people is a whole nother step. I've kind of tried the prescriptive top-down approach, should do this, and it just doesn't build capacity. I don't want people that conform and listen. I want people that are excited and people that are empowered. And that takes a little longer, but geez, it's worth it when you get a team of people who are excited about something moving towards a common goal. Like it, there's nothing like it. And so even this week with my team, we talked about, once again, we brought the butcher's paper out and we thought, hey, we did this last term. Is there anything else you'd like to add? What does quality reading look like? And so we're constantly working through the process. We're looking at research. We have an incredible organization called the Centre for Education Statistics and Evaluation. I think I might have sent that book through to you potentially. If not, I will after this. Excuse me. And this is a wonderful resource by the New South Wales government, which is where I work. And so we will open a page of that and we'll talk about what it looks like, and we'll add it to our piece of paper. We'll go through it. I'll be in classrooms doing lessons of observations and say, hey, when I go in today, what are the things you think I should be looking for if I'm focusing on reading? Specifically, we have professional learning goals. I'm sure you do everywhere around the world for teachers, but we have a common goal specifically around reading this year. And so we all know that we're having those conversations about what does it look like. When I find a great piece of professional learning, I can send it through, and that means it's relevant to everyone. So we've got common goals, we've got common language. And also I think we've got a really great collaborative practice where I think we have a much better culture now of learning. And so now we even talk about the books we're reading at home as staff members. We go, yes, what about that? It would be great. Probably not appropriate for 10-year-olds, but it's a great book. And so, yeah, I think it's really lovely to do that. And I think to be a leader is a completely different ballgame, and it takes an adjustment and it takes an empowering of those people that you lead. And so I don't know, I did a great job of that in my early years, but I think I'm definitely learning a little bit more.
Wonderful.
You might have to ask them that and see what you might have to ask my team that and see what they say.
Maybe I will. Now, one of the things that I know a lot of teachers in the beginning of this journey, especially when their schools are still very balanced literacy, they do so much in their classroom in that 1 year, and they're sending their kids to a classroom that focuses in balanced literacy and changes, turns everything upside down from all the hard work that they've done in their classroom. And then the next year they're told to look at pictures. Have you experienced that? And yeah, I guess first, have you experienced that?
So can I just clarify, do you mean that continuation from one class?
One grade to the next, right?
In terms of practice or lack of practice or?
Yeah, exactly. So you have your kids for a year in kindergarten, and then they move up to the first grade, and first grade teacher does it differently.
Definitely. And I think that's a challenge as well, because every classroom should be unique, but there should be some underlying best practices. So I think that is a challenge, isn't it? I think talking about these things about what do I expect to see are really important, and then staff can go and interpret that how they like. So they may choose to organise their classroom in particular ways. So I think having those common threads based on good practice is really important. Definitely. I think I remember in a school that I taught in previously, there was this real focus on silent reading. So you would, in this particular class, not this school, so a focus on silent reading where kids would come in and read a book for 20 minutes once they came from recess. And I just remember, and that was a process that only happened in that classroom. And I remember trying to have a conversation with the teacher about that, to say, look, tell me the purpose with this. And the purpose was that they would come in quite heightened from recess and then read a book and it would be okay. And then I thought, okay, I understand what you're saying, but is this developing this love and this passion for reading, or is it just compliance? And how do you know if they're being successful? How do you know if they're loving what they're doing? How do you choose the text selection? So it opened a whole range of questions about that. And I think, so yes, to answer your question, it's definitely difference in practice. I think a lot of a number of people may hold on to things that they did at school or that they've done previously and not be willing to challenge their practice and not be willing to change their mind. And so one of the ways I do that is, one of the things I don't do is say, you mustn't do that. This is how I expect you to do it, because we all know that people are going to do what they want unless they have a why.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm also not in there all the time because I have my own class. And so I think these conversations, these little check-in conversations that we would have every stage meeting or a couple of times a term about what reading looks like are really important, because we can start to untwine some of those tangled threads around practice and reading. But change is really hard. And I think I've definitely come across well, it worked when I was at school, so why do I need to change? And then my question is, like, how do you know it works? Like, how do you know? And that's always a bit of an awkward conversation. And it's difficult, isn't it? Because I don't think, I've never come across, like, I work with some phenomenal teachers who are far more expert. I think about what I was like in my first couple of years, and I see these amazing teachers, and I think, wow, like, you have so much ahead of you. And it's quite often not those early teachers. It's quite often the people that have been teaching sort of, some cases, 20 or 30 years. And so challenging that assumption is hard, because I really don't believe there's any malice there. I think people are trying to do their best. For them, it seems to be working because the kids are settled and they're reading and all that kind of stuff. So, but that's not the case. So I think beginning to challenge those assumptions is really important. I don't really like those discussions, and I think I've probably got better at them. But I always come back to, like, and I think I ask myself this every day, like, if my child, my biological child, was in my class or had me as their teacher or teacher like me, would I be happy with it? And the answer is no. Some days you go, oh, probably not, that wasn't a great lesson. But if it's consistently no, then you need to start to change your practice, and that's hard. And so we talk a lot about like assessment and reading and what does success look like. And my view is that if a child is sitting there reading silently a random book that they find in the bookshelf, I just wonder how meaningful that is. And so starting to have those conversations, I think about, is this developing a love of reading for our children? How do you know when they're successful? So yeah, it's a really complicated thing. And I think sort of naively, when I came into the role, I just assumed that you just say stuff and it happens and change happens. And that is ridiculous. And so as a leader, I think it's about choosing your battles sometimes and choosing the main thing that you want to address, and sometimes the hill that you want to die on, I think. But for me, like, I feel like I'm incredibly impatient and I want stuff to happen yesterday, but change takes time. And so if we're going to develop a love and a passion for reading and the teaching of reading and the science of reading with our staff and our students, that's going to take years and years and years. We're not going to get it done before recess on a Monday morning. And I also know how important, and going back to my wonderful first supervisor, Sam, she didn't tell me what to do. She just listened and she watched and she allowed me the freedom to figure it out myself and ask for help when I needed it. And I think that is really important, to have those things in place. I think are exceptionally important. And bearing in mind, there were standards. Like, Sam was like, you knew what she was thinking, like, she was a strong, incredibly gifted, incredibly talented leader. And there were standards and there were expectations. And so I think as a leader, it's that balance, isn't it, between maintaining standards, maintaining expectations, maintaining excellence, but also providing the environment in which people can ask questions and go, hey, like, I really don't know what I'm doing. Can you please help me? And as I mentioned, like, reading was not something that I feel like I was taught at university. And so I am very much still learning how to do it, and I don't always do it well. And so I want to be that person that creates an environment and goes on the process of learning how to do it with my team. yeah, it's in terms of different practices in different classrooms, it's absolutely. And I think we have to get back to that shared understanding, that research-backed and research-based understanding of what reading is, and just agree on some of the central elements. And I think, I don't know, is that sort of similar to what, I guess, what you've seen in your research? Is there sort of a breadth of perspectives of what good reading looks like? And do you just look at some things and go, no.
Actually, a friend of mine, Nathaniel Hansford, just released a blog post. It was, I can't remember the exact term, but it's like, I was wrong. And he's talking about, all the conceptions that he's had over the years about reading, and then saying, you know what, I was wrong about that. So
Wow.
understanding the growth. And I know even in my own work with the different things that I've done over the years, I'm like, oh my God, why did I even say that? Right.
Yeah.
So it's understanding that you're human, you have things to learn, and it's going to take growth and change. And you have to be willing and committed to allowing that to happen and not have your blinders on.
I think that's so important. I've just had a little one wake up. And so I'll just give her a quick cuddle. I think she wants to say,
oh, of course.
Baby, come here. Come here, little cranky one. Okay, we're working on it. It's very early over here. But I think that's so important. And I do that as well. Like I'll turn around and say, like, I was wrong about that. Like, that was not right. And research changes and understanding changes and all of that kind of stuff. And so I think admitting when you're wrong and moving forward, like, I know the amount of research, the amount of change in the research around practice of reading that has come out in the 15 years or so since I've been teaching is phenomenal. And so I think we have to challenge our assumptions and never get to a point where we think, I've got this, I'm an expert. We have to be learning all the time. And I think what a wonderful example from your colleague that he's turned around and say, hey, I got that wrong. Like, there's no point pretending that it's right if evidence says otherwise. And that's, I think, sometimes is an awkward realization, but also incredibly admirable that someone can turn around and say, hey, yeah, sorry about that, but let's move on. And good on you for realizing that in yourself as well, where you go, oh, okay, never mind. But I mean, I think that's great.
And I think you need to realize that whether you like it or not, you're human. And you have to set realistic expectations of yourself. I mean, the number of journal articles and blog posts and podcasts and learning material out there is incredible, but it's unrealistic to expect to listen to them all. I mean, I'm one of those people that have 5 different browsers open, and each one probably has, 10 different tabs of things. Oh, I want to look at that. I want to read this. I need to go back to that. And it's just realizing that you need to prioritize where you think you're going to have the most learning and the biggest impact based on your current needs. And, the science of reading, the science of learning, the science of math, structured literacy, structured numeracy, structured learning, whatever you want to call it, there is so much information out there. And of course, the desire to become an expert in all of this, or in all of it, is there, but realizing you need to analyze where you're at in your situation so that you can prioritize the learning that you need to do to make those changes.
Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think about the wisdom of my supervisor, Sam, who said, like, just choose like one thing. Choose one thing, do it well, choose one of those like sort of high impact things that are really going to make a difference. And I want to do everything. I want to do everything yesterday, and what I tend to do is, if you choose, in my experience, if you choose multiple focuses, then nothing's a focus. And so I wanted a quick win. I wanted something that would make me feel like I was doing something significant in my reading program. and also something that was really easy. Like it was kind of like low hanging fruit. And so that was, I think, really good advice. Like choose something that works well, speak to colleagues, get your book, have a look at research, listen to a podcast, have a conversation, and just choose something that you could do today to do that and be committed to the journey. As I said, 15 years later, I'm still learning, and I hope that I always will learn. And there are things that I change in my practice all of the time. But choose one thing, implement it well, maintain that, keep up the practice, and just move on to the next. And schools, I know of my experiences obviously in Australia, but schools in Australia are incredibly well resourced. It's really lovely to have some amazing, like even now I have colleagues that are true experts in their field that I can call up and go, how do I do this? And I've been teaching a long time, and positioning yourself, I think, as a learner is extremely important. And and I just give yourself a bit of a break. I think, like do things that are fun. Get great books. Like take your kids to the library. Like we have a class library in our room. Sounds so simple, but it's made up of stories that kids have chosen from our library. So I'll say, okay, everybody go get a book. And so then that becomes part of our reading program. And when little Johnny's sitting on the floor and he sees that Mr. Green's picked his book to read to the class that he's picked from the library, that says so much to these students. And so I think take the time, do the research, and just try something. And because it is a skill that will benefit kids for life. It's worth it. It's worth putting in the effort, I think.
Definitely. And recognizing that each year you're going to have a unique makeup of these amazing brains in your class. And you may start off the year saying, okay, this year I'm going to focus my learning in this direction. But then when you get your class, you realize you need to shift that focus based on the makeup.
Definitely. I think that's so important. So we've got a little visitor that's joined us. It looks like she's not going back to bed. But you just see a nest of hair. I think that's a great point. And I know, like, it could be, there's of course, and you are far more experienced than I am in this, but the science of reading is complicated. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of words. There's phonology and phonemic awareness and all of those words that sound like they start with F, but they start with a PH, which is incredibly confusing. And all of these, there is a science, and it's very complicated, but there are things that we can do as educators in our classroom that are good practice that will help equip us to implement great reading programs. And I think choosing one or two things, like I said, we are, like, how blessed are we? Like, people can listen to your podcast. People can buy a book for $25 or whatever it is online, written by experts. People can go to a library. People can have conversations with peers, and we are resourced. And I think choosing one thing and doing it well and giving yourself a little bit of a break, I think, is really important, because it's worth it. And I say to my staff, like, if you get this right, like if you get a love of reading and a passion and an excitement for books and excitement for text in your classroom, like, you are going to set up your kids for life. And so I think if we do all these other things in schools, which are so important, if we miss reading, we've just missed the point, like, it's the thing that holds, I believe, that understanding, it holds everything else together. And so it's worth doing. I mean, practically in my class, the morning session from 9 to 10 every day is my reading group session. And so within that, I have 6 groups of kids, and I will read with 3 groups a day, and they're all differentiated reading groups. I'll pull them out. We'll have a specific focus for the text that we're looking at. At the moment, we're looking at imaginative texts around poetry. So we're looking at haikus and all of these wonderful imaginative texts. We're looking at websites and audio books. And so for me, that morning session from 9 till 10 is precious, and it does not, it's not compromised. And so every single day, the kids know that when they come in, they go and do their reading group activities. It could be a phonics activity. It could be a free writing task. It could be, there's so many different types of things that they do, but they know that that happens every day. And so I remember I missed it once because we had an assembly and my kids were so disappointed. They said, "Mr. Green, you promised that we could read today." I go, you can, guys, we'll be doing it afterwards. And I love that. I love that they feel like they're missing out if we don't do it. And I have kids of all different abilities, all different backgrounds. And like, I'll look over from my desk when I'm working with a group, and to see a little pocket of them laughing at Roald Dahl, or a little pocket of them laughing at something that they've read in the book, or saying, "Oh, that reminds me of when I went to the beach with my family," or "That reminds me of the time I went on a road trip and the car broke down." And I love that. I love that there is just this laughter and this excitement around text and reading. And for me, that's, and this is all classes that I work in, but that's actually quite intentional. And we started off with those conversations about, what does good practice look like? Like, what would I expect to see? What conversations would I have with kids when I'm in class? And it's really lovely. It's something that I'm so proud of with what we've achieved as a team, is having that consistency and just generating that love and that passion for reading. Is if that's all if that's my lasting memory as a teacher, I'm good. I'm done. I'm happy with that. So yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for joining me today. Do you have any final thoughts about reading that we haven't covered?
Not really, other than, like, I'm not an expert. Like, I'm a very proud classroom teacher and school leader. But there is a whole science of reading that I am just discovering. And I would encourage people to reach out and to get your resources, and to talk to colleagues, and to read articles, and partner with people that are truly experts in the science of reading. I'm someone who has experience, but I'm someone who has tried a lot of things. A lot of things haven't worked, but a few things have. And so my feedback to those people that are listening, whether you are a new teacher, whether you are a more experienced teacher, or anywhere in between, is have a go, speak to your colleagues, read the research, buy your book or books, go on your website, check out your resources, and begin this lifelong journey of learning how to teach reading well, and also have fun doing it. It's great fun. So my feedback would be, partner with people that truly know what they're doing, and have a go. Choose one thing, implement it well, and enjoy the process, because it's worth it. I mean, when you see kids come back to your class or come back to your school once they've graduated, and they speak to me about how they got into university, or how they learned how to read in my class, or how they love books, or how they've entered a writing competition and won, or come second, or whatever, it makes it all worth it. So it's definitely worth it. And keep trying and keep getting up and keep going again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. It's always wonderful speaking to you.